Battlefield Command podcast will take you into the very heart of battles, ranging from the ancient world down to the wars of decolonization. You will be able to learn the strategies and tactics of military commanders throughout time. You can see the events play out from the viewpoints of the average soldier with sources permitting. My podcast allows listeners to follow the story of how the battles began, how they are fought, and finally the aftermath of the engagements. Find Battlefield Command History Podcast on whichever audio platform serves you best for podcasts.
The Transoxianan Turks of the Timurid period had military discipline in their blood. Ranks formed without word of command, orders were anticipated before drum or trumpet sounded, and the young men were broken to the profession of arms by 2 centuries of raiding rigorously applied. These forces, born of Genghis Khanite discipline, imposed upon Turkish valor, endured for 200 years without ever having that opportunity to give free rein to their warlike temperament. Men of the Orkhan under Kublai had the whole of the Far East as their theater of conquest. Those of the Golden Horde galloped to the gates of Vienna. Those of Hulagu strove to reach the waters of the rivers of Egypt. Only the Turco-Mongols of this middle kingdom of Turkestan and Chagatai, encircled by the other 3 Khanates, only these Turco-Mongols were forced to mark time. But now, suddenly the barriers about them were down. Westward, no Khanate of Persia hemmed the Transoxianans in. The northwest was held by a golden horde in decline, incapable now of barring the way. In the direction of the Gobi, the way was open, for Moghulistan lay in ruins. The Sultanate of Delhi was in momentary collapse and in no state to guard the Indus as it had in the days of the first Jagatites. Tamerlane's Transoxianans sped forth in all directions. They had a long period of enforced idleness to make up for, during which conquest had been enjoyed by the outer Turco-Mongolian Khanates alone, while the men of Transoxiana had been cut off from the glories and rewards of Mongol warfare. Now, at last, their hour had come. The quote you just heard comes from René Grousset's excellent history, The Empire of the Steppes, A History of Central Asia. These words are what he uses to lead directly into the conquests of Timur. And while I do love the quote, while it sets anticipation and dread for what's about to happen, the situation is a bit more complicated for Timur at this time. As we've seen through the last few episodes, these men of Transoxiana were anything but a unified body. Sure, they were the descendants of the warriors of Genghis Khan. Yes, their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had forged the largest empire the world had ever seen, and yes, now they lived in what was once the Chagatai Khanate, one of the 4 great Mongol Khanates. But to simply lump all of these people into one body, one faction, is a bit of a simplified move, especially in the early 1370s. These people did not think of themselves as Chagatites or Transoxianans or even Timurids. No, these were people of the Arlat tribe, of the Kudalani tribe, or citizens of the cities of Bukhara or Kesh. Their cultural identity came primarily from their tribe or city. Last episode, we saw just how dangerous this political situation could be for anybody brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to claim leadership over all of the tribes. To do so was to gamble, and Timur was now gambling for everything he had, whether he wanted to or not. His position, his power, his soldiers, his land, his family, and then, of course, his life are all balancing on the edge of a knife. He had shown the tribes that he was a born leader, a natural tactician, and a man not afraid to hold his own sword. But that impressive resume was not nearly enough to maintain his safety. At any moment, the system underneath Timur could shatter into 100 pieces. The tribes are watching for that moment of weakness, that moment to pounce. As soon as Timur's rule doesn't benefit their tribe or them personally, they will be his enemies. And as we saw last episode, Timur hadn't even taken the throne yet before certain chess moves were being made behind his back. Amir Musa, one of the best commanders in Transoxiana and a loyal ally to Amir Hussein, Amir Musa turned on Timur almost as soon as he had joined him. And with Musa, Zinda Hisham of the Aparti tribe also joined forces to remove this annoying upstart Timur. Now, as we saw, Timur very wisely and effectively defeated this rebellion as quickly as he possibly could. On the surface of things, this might appear that Timur was secure on his throne, but in reality, it was the exact opposite. The rebellions of Musa and Zinda Hisham showed everybody that Timur's reign was not going to go unquestioned. And in fact, Timur's actions to quell this squabble probably only encouraged other tribal leaders to start rethinking their loyalty to Timur. Remember that most of these tribes do not want a centralized Khan-like figure that they have to submit to. They may be willing to ride with Timur for a while as long as the slaves and treasures keep rolling in, but if this guy is crushing any opposition, then perhaps he's trying to be more than just the leader of a seasonal raiding party. And if you and I are the leaders of a tribe, that could spell disaster for our autonomy. But of course, as is often the case, nobody was more aware of this situation than Timur himself. Time was against him. His closest allies and friends could turn on him at any moment. Every single night that he sleeps is another night that anybody could slip a dagger into his throat. In Chapter 10 of The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, Machiavelli outlines how a leader of a city should act if he finds his city under siege. He says this: "If the people have property outside the city and they see it burnt, they will not remain patient, and the long siege and self-interest will make them forget their prince." Similarly, although the tribes of Transoxiana are not under siege at the moment, as Machiavelli said, it's that self-interest that trumps any and all loyalty to a leader. As soon as they begin counting their losses, they will forget their prince. But Machiavelli continues, and he says this: "To this I answer that a powerful and courageous prince will overcome all such difficulties by giving at one time hope to his subjects that the evil will not last for long, and to also remind them of the fear of the cruelty of the enemy." So, while Machiavelli's scenario doesn't line up perfectly with Transoxiana in 1370, the answer is the same. Timur needs to refocus the attention of the tribes away from himself, away from his leadership, and towards an outside force. Remind the people of the cruelties that foreigners have caused. Focus the wrath of the tribes on anybody but yourself. Unite the disunited with a common enemy. And then, most importantly, any glory that is achieved by doing this, any victory, must lead back directly to Timur. It must be known that Timur is the reason for all and any success. And this brings us to the first invasions of Amir Timur. Now, unfortunately, before we jump right into this, I do have to pause to make two quick clarifications. Of course I do, right? It's what I do. So, Timur's first targets of invasion will be Moghulistan, which we've talked about before. This is the land of the Moguls, the eastern half of the former Chagatai Khanate, which had invaded Transoxiana on more than one occasion. Not only are they one of Timur's oldest foes, of course, ignoring that time he allied with them in order to further his own position, but let's ignore that pesky little detail for now. But they are also some of the most regular foes of the tribes of Transoxiana, so they are an obvious first target. And the other target that Timur will invade soon is the land of Khwarezm, or in particular the Sufi dynasty of Khwarezm. And this is where the history gets confusing and tricky and, well, annoying. The vast majority of primary and even secondary sources refer to these military operations as invasions. Thus, you'll come across various chapters that read Timur's first invasion of Moghulistan or something similar. But I don't like the term invasion, even though that's what's generally used here. Because here's the thing. Timur is going to invade Moghulistan several times. He's also going to invade Khwarezm several times. Now, when I think invasion, I think scenarios such as when the Third Reich invaded France. The Germans crossed the borders, invaded, and occupied. And that's the key here. When I think invasion, I think ensuing occupation or conquest. If I'm told that Timur invades Khwarezm 5 times, that doesn't make sense to me. Were the first 4 invasions failures? Why did it take so many times before he conquered the region? So I huffed and I puffed and I furiously typed up the definition of invasion on Google. And guess what? Surprise, surprise, turns out I was wrong. Unfortunately, I didn't keep the receipt for my degree in military history because an invasion does not necessarily need to include subjugation or conquest of territory. It simply means the crossing of troops into a region that doesn't belong to them. So I wanted to make that quick note in case anybody like me might be confused about how the word invasion is used here and how I will be using it. And speaking of the definition of invasion, that leads me to my second note here. Our different sources define invasions differently. Yeah, isn't that annoying? So basically, it's hard to find a definitive... it's hard to speak, and it's also hard to find a definitive number on just how many times Timur invaded both Moghulistan and Khwarezmia in the first decade or so of his rule. One author might describe a single invasion that had 2 separate campaigns during different seasons, while another author might define those 2 campaigns as 2 separate invasions. So all that to say, if you can't tell, I got really caught up on this term invasion. It's been haunting me in my sleep, and I threw a dictionary at my therapist. But as we progress through these invasions of Moghulistan and Khwarezm, know that I have done my best to try and line up all the interpretations of invasion among the authors. But if somebody gives you a different number of invasions, they're probably not wrong. It's just a matter of differing definitions. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, and now that you never want to hear me say the word invasion again, let's talk about Timur's first invasions. We've talked about Moghulistan quite a bit in the past. One of the 4 khanates of the Mongol Empire, the Chagatai Khanate, split into 2 parts in the 1340s due to both political strife and differences in lifestyles. The western half, Transoxiana, or Mawarnar, is where Timur was born and where he eventually took power. But the eastern half became known as Moghulistan. The term Moghulistan is Persian for the land of the Mongols, but this is a bit misleading as it's not the original land of the Mongols, that being Mongolia. With Genghis Khan, though, the Mongols spread out across half the world and many settled in what would be called Moghulistan. Thus, in order to differentiate between the Mongols living in Mongolia at this time and the Mongols living in Moghulistan, we keep the Persian word for Moguls. The Moguls were the ones living in Moghulistan. The Moguls were mostly Mongolian, but they were a different political entity than their brethren in the further east. As to the land that Moghulistan pertains to, today Moghulistan would include parts of eastern Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and northwestern China. Geographically speaking, there were basically 2 biomes in Moghulistan. There was the steppe flatland, which was very attractive to the original Mongol invaders, causing many to settle here. And then there was also the Altai Mountains in the south, with the few cities of Moghulistan usually built on the feet of the mountains. Politically, Moghulistan was much like Mawarnar in the 14th century. With the collapse of the Chagatai Khanate and the split of these 2 regions, internal strife was rampant. Between 1306 and 1370, Moghulistan had 20 khans, most of whom were short-lived and ineffective. Arguably, though, the greatest of these khans was a man we've already talked about many episodes ago. This was Tughlaq Timur, a descendant of Genghis Khan and Khan of Moghulistan from 1347 until his death in 1363. It was this Tughlaq Timur who had invaded Transoxiana several times while Timur was still a young man, leading to the incident of Timur leaving his uncle and the Barlas tribe in order to try his luck with the Mughal invaders. Tughlaq Timur's invasions of Transoxiana were successful, and for a brief time he managed to unite the two halves back into the reformed Chagatai Khanate, and this was from about 1360 until 1363. In addition to these invasions, Tughlaq Timur is also remembered in history for converting to Islam and thus being a big player in bringing Islam to the region and the peoples of Moghulistan. You might remember the traditional story that goes along with this conversion. According to tradition, Tughlaq Timur was hunting one day when he came across a Persian traveler trespassing on his hunting grounds. Tughlaq Timur began harassing the Persian for his race, exclaiming at one point, "Ha! Even a dog is worth more than a Persian." But to this, the traveler replied, "Indeed it is true. We would all be worth less than dogs if it was not for the mercy of Allah." And being so moved and interested by this response, Tughlaq Timur spared the man and invited him to share more about his faith, and the rest is history. But Tughlaq Timur's reign was to meet an unexpected end with the young man's death at the age of about 33 or 34. Interestingly enough, however, we know where he is buried, and you can visit his museum in the ruins of the city of Al-Malik in western China. Anyway, the throne of Moghulistan then went to Tughlaq Timur's son, Ilyas Hoja, another man we've discussed. Ilyas Hoja ruled from his father's death in 1363 until his own death in 1368. Ilyas Hoja tried to keep his father's conquests of Transoxiana under his grasp, but was repelled at the siege of Samarkand when the citizens defended their own city against him. It was also this Ilyas Hoja who Timur saw some of his first key battles against. Most notably, in about 1365, Ilyas Hoja defeated Timur and Hussein at the Battle of the Mire, also called the Battle of Tashkent. But as Timur would eventually come to learn 5 years after this, claiming authority over the many differing tribes was a ticking time bomb, and Moghulistan, like Transoxiana, was filled with ambitious tribal leaders looking for their own way to climb to the top. One of these leaders was a man named Kamaruddin from the Duklat tribe, a Mughal tribe. Kamaruddin was one of the more powerful leaders in Moghulistan, and he'd been a close ally to Khan Tughlaq Timur. This alliance led Kamaruddin to feel confident enough to ask Tughlaq Timur to be the next leader of Moghulistan. But Tughlaq Timur refused, instead proclaiming that his son Ilyas Hoja would be the heir, as we just discussed. Thus, with Tughlaq Timur's death and Ilyas Hoja taking the throne, Kamaruddin immediately began a rebellion. This rebellion lasted for Ilyas Hoja's entire reign. Thus, you might remember that while Timur and Hussein were fighting Khan Ilyas Hoja in the west, Ilyas Hoja would at times need to retreat back home in order to deal with rebellion. Well, this rebellion was led by this guy, Kamaruddin. And eventually, the rebellion was a success. In 1368, Kamaruddin defeated Ilyas Hoja, and while the details are lost to us, Ilyas Hoja was probably killed by Kamaruddin. But what we do know is that to ensure his security as the new ruler of Moghulistan, Kamaruddin seized and murdered the 18 sons of Ilyas Hoja in order to end that line. As a side note, though, one son did escape, and he was hidden by loyal friends, and much later down the road we will meet this kid, but that is many episodes from now. Anyways, by 1368, Kamaruddin was the ruler of Moghulistan, and he even pronounced himself Khan, which alienated some of the tribes, but also gave some clout to his position. But just like we're seeing with Timur, Kamaruddin's greatest enemy were the tribes he ruled. And throughout the 20 or so years that he will rule, Kamaruddin will very often be fighting down rebellions and civil war attempts. This whole situation got so out of control that the very land of Moghulistan was devastated for decades as constant war and raiding ravaged the countryside. The few towns and cities of settled peoples in Moghulistan soon became deserted as the raids only increased. One traveler who passed through Moghulistan during this time reported what had become the norm in this land. From a distance, one sees a well-built village with beautiful green surroundings, but on approaching in the hope of meeting inhabitants, only deserted houses are found. The population is composed entirely of nomads, shepherds, and people who graze. They do not cultivate the soil or sow crops. There is no other lifestyle but that of the steppes. And with this destruction of the settled population in Moghulistan, trade took a big hit, with many merchants going hundreds of miles out of their ways to bypass this entire region altogether on their way to and from China. All this to say, while Kamaruddin was now indeed Khan of Moghulistan, the land was destroyed, the cities were desolate, and many of his own tribes stood against him. In other words, this was the perfect first target for Timur to invade. The Mughals were traditional enemies of Timur's people. Even tribes who hated Timur also hated the Mughals. They remembered what the Mughal invasions had done to their people only a few years earlier. A little payback might be welcome. So this begins the first invasion of Moghulistan. Now again, depending on what author you might read, this could be the first and second invasions, but I'm going to group them together as they're both rather short encounters. The fighting began in 1370, very shortly after Timur had put down the rebellion of Amir Musa and Zinda Hisham. Several Mughal tribes living near the borders of Transoxiana declared their loyalty to Timur and then proceeded to attack other Mughal tribes. Again, while this is a case of Mughals attacking Mughals, remember that they don't really see themselves this way. They are first and foremost men of their own tribe, and joining Timur's banner might give them a nice excuse and some nice backup for taking advantage of the precarious situation in Moghulistan. Anyway, this change in allegiance leads to some infighting between the various Mughal tribes living near the western border. There's some raiding, some border skirmishes, but nothing too substantial. And that's it. So does that qualify as an invasion? I wouldn't think so. Timur wasn't even there, but some authors call that the first invasion. Whatever, I am over it. But the second part to this 1370 war with Moghulistan begins with Timur deciding to join the fight himself. Yazdi reminds us with this: Timur, who was never pleased until he had finished what he had begun, resolved to go in person to the country of the Geats, that is, the country of the Mughals. Thus, the call to war was given out. Men from all across Transoxiana gathered their horses and strapped on their armor in order to answer the emir's call. They gathered at Samarkand, beginning a new tradition, if you can call it that, of Timur's army gathering at his capital before any great campaign. For this is the first of many. Once gathered, Timur mounted his own horse and put on his own armor. The drums were beat, the banners raised, and Timur's army went to war. Surely there were many in his ranks who were displeased that they now rode behind him. Without a doubt, there were men wanting that opportunity in which they could loose an arrow right into Timur's body, but now all these different tribes, all of these thousands of men, they were all united. Not by Timur, not by the land of Transoxiana, but for the spoils of war. Upon reaching the border of Moghulistan, Timur linked up with some of those Mughal tribes who had declared allegiance to him, and now with this full force, the raiding began. Caravans were attacked, farms were burned to the ground, villages were wiped out with the occupants thrown into slavery to be sold back home. All the while, though, Timur is scouting for Kamaruddin's army, which will surely arrive to defend against the invaders. But whenever Kamaruddin's forces are seen, they flee as fast as they can away from Timur. And with every inch that Timur moves forward, his odds of survival increase. As Beatrice Manns reminds us, this was Timur brilliantly turning the energies of Transoxiana outwards. As the gold and horses and slaves rolled in, the hunger of the tribes was quenched a bit more, pushing Timur a bit further away from their jaws. Further, in addition to the spoils of raiding, the steppe of Moghulistan brought another bonus that is easy to overlook. It's important to remember that the vast majority of Timur's soldiers are, and will continue to be, mostly mounted warriors. These men rode, lived, and fought on horseback, sometimes bringing with them as many as 6 or 7 horses in order to always have one that was rested for the road ahead. And while having an army of some of the fiercest mounted warriors in history at your command comes with some tremendous advantages, it also means that you have to feed thousands of horses in addition to your own men. If not handled well, this could become disastrous. It could go badly very quickly. Since Moghulistan was mostly steppe prairie though, keeping the horses fed wasn't much of a problem at all. It also meant that you weren't using your own grassland back home, giving you a better reserve for the winter or for later engagements. I bring this up now because it can be very easy to forget this critical part to steppe warfare. And as we continue to follow Timur on his conquests, keeping his horses fed and alive will become quite problematic at times. The steppe of Moghulistan is basically the backyard of Timur's men. It's familiar country. But what happens when you're in the mountains of Persia, or the deserts of Syria, or the dry lands of Anatolia, or the frozen wastelands of Siberia? How on earth do you feed an army of horses then? Well, that's something we'll have to check in on much later down the road. Anyway, back to the first invasion of Moghulistan. That's actually pretty much all there was to it. Timur's forces met little opposition, Kamaruddin was nowhere to be found, and they rode back home with as much plunder and slaves as they could carry. There is one more legend that comes with this invasion that I will share though, and because of the confusing way invasion is used, as we've gone over 1 billion times by now, this story might have taken place during Timur's 1370 excursion into Moghulistan, or it might have happened at a later date with a later invasion. Whatever the case, I'm going to share the story now, because it's one of those fantastic history tidbits that just makes it all so worth it. As the story goes, Timur and his men are raiding in Moghulistan, and as I mentioned earlier about the geography of Moghulistan, most of it was steppe, but there were mountainous regions in the south. So while nearing these mountains, Timur's forces engaged some Mughals who were retreating into the mountains. Now, this was a problem. Most of Timur's men are not used to fighting in mountains, and it certainly wouldn't be easy for their horses either. So Timur holds back most of his men, but orders a detachment of archers to pursue the enemy into the mountains. However, before they go, Timur orders each archer to find a small pebble, so that each man is now holding one in his palm. Then he tells them to all put their pebbles into a pile. The idea behind this is quite simple, but ingenious. After the archers return from the chase, each returning man will go grab one pebble and then continue on their way. After the last man returns, grabs his pebble, Timur will be able to count the remaining rocks, which is a quick way for him to know just how many men he lost in the mountain battle. And so they do this, and then the archers head into the mountains. After an undisclosed amount of time, they return victorious. They successfully chased the enemy down and wiped them out. But the returning men are not joyful in their victory. They're bloodied, exhausted, and there are far fewer now than those who had been sent into the mountains. As the story goes, each man collected his pebble, and when they had all passed, the pile of rocks remained almost unchanged in its size, so great had Timur's casualties been. Now, this could just be a story. It might have happened, or at least something similar to it, but it is useful to us in that it shows the mind of a brilliant tactician who prepares for the worst, calculates losses, and keeps track of his own men. And the more we follow Timur on his conquests, and especially when we start diving into his strategies, this side to Timur will only become more evident. But anyway, returning to the narrative, this ended Timur's 1370 invasion of Moghulistan. The years are a bit fuzzy. Timur probably returned back home with his army in either late 1371 or 1372. But his men were happy with the spoils of the raids. His eastern border was secure for now, and it seemed that he might have a moment to catch his breath. But that was not the case. Last episode, we saw how Zinda Hisham, a leader in the Apardi tribe, had tried on 2 occasions to resist the rule of Timur. The first time he had allied with Amir Musa, but surrendered once Timur approached their fortress, and the second episode saw Zinda Hisham resist again, but ended with his army being destroyed while crossing a bridge of boats over a river. After this, Timur stripped Zinda Hisham of his lands and titles and brought him back to Samarkand to keep a closer eye on him. But while Timur was off raiding in Moghulistan, his enemies back at home had not been idle. A circle of conspirators arose. This included Zinda Hisham, Amir Musa, and several other various leaders, and their goal was to assassinate Timur just like their fathers and forefathers had done to any arrogant Amir who had overextended their hands in decades prior. They would wait for Timur to go on a hunt, which was a common pastime for powerful men at this time. Then, while on his hunt, Timur would be ambushed and murdered, ending his career once and for all. Unfortunately for these men, though, Timur's successes brought him many loyal allies, eager to join in on the victories. We don't know how or why, but somebody leaked the conspiracy to Timur when Timur returned to Samarkand. Timur immediately sent soldiers to seize the men, and had Amir Musa and Zinda Hisham brought directly before him to answer for their treason. Both men were convicted of this treason, but handing out sentences is where things get a little trickier for Timur. Did he have enough support to execute traitors? Execution of men as prominent as these men was a very rare and disliked practice in medieval Central Asia. After all, like we've covered 1,000 times, alliances, politics, friendships, these all were in almost constant change. The politics of the steppe were forever in a fluid motion. So, in a society where backstabbings and betrayals were A, not uncommon, and B, not nearly as looked down upon as they might be in, say, a democratic country today, could you really dare to kill somebody for this concept of treason? Again, though, if anybody knows the limits to this system, it's Timur. And he shows us again with this situation. Amir Musa was somebody who Timur had known for a while. They had been friends at one point so many months ago. They had fought the Mughals side by side on more than one occasion. At the Battle of the Bridge, Timur had managed to outflank and surround the Mughals only because it was Musa who had been the brave one to lead the defense on that bridge. The two men had a history of camaraderie, and everybody knew this. Would Timur kill somebody whom he had gone through so much with? And if he did, how on earth would his current friends and brothers in arms take that? And it gets even more complicated. Remember back to the saga with Amir Hussein. Musa and Hussein had been loyal friends and allies for a long, long time. Timur's autobiography called Musa the right arm and commander-in-chief of Hussein's forces. And in addition to this, Musa and Hussein had been brothers-in-law, much like Timur and Hussein had been. Musa's sister, Sarai Mulkhanum, was married to Hussein. But now, if you'll remember, after Hussein was removed from power and killed, or mysteriously died, Timur took this woman, Sarai, as his own wife. This was the same Sarai who was the descendant of the Genghis Khan, allowing Timur to take the title of son-in-law. So you've connected the dots here. That means Musa and Timur are probably brothers in marriage. Now, there is a little bit of confusion about who's who and whose sister and brother is who, and there's a lot of confusion in my own head right now, as you can tell. But the sources I'm going to go with here indicate that Musa and Timur are now brothers in marriage. And as you may have concluded, executing Musa for treason was probably too dangerous a move for Timur to make. As such, Timur spared Musa, and Yazdi gives us the words that Timur said to him. "The crime thou hast committed is great, but because we are related, I pardon you, and I will not venge myself, and thus you may say it was your alliance with me and the extreme old age which saved your life. For if it had not been for that, I should have ordered that your head, which intended evil against me, to have been separated from your body." Thus, Musa was spared and allowed to live out the rest of his days in peace, although with a close eye from Timur. As for Zinda Hisham, though, Timur had had enough. This was a man who would not learn his lesson, it seemed. What remaining possessions he had were seized, his titles were given to more loyal men, and he was thrown into a dungeon in Samarkand. Soon thereafter, Zinda Hisham died. There is a conspiracy that Timur had him killed in his dungeon, but we'll never know for sure. But as for Timur, though, again, this whole episode brought a very clear message. The spoils of Moghulistan were far from enough. It's going to take quite a bit more to ransom Timur's life from the energies and wrath of the tribes. If Timur wants to survive, the conquests must continue. This has been the Timur Podcast. Thank you for listening, and if you want to reach out to me at any time for any reason, always feel free to do so via my email at timurpodcast@gmail.com or follow the show on Twitter or Facebook at Timur Podcast. This episode was a bit shorter than I originally intended, and I also have missed a few weeks. I'm in the middle of changing jobs, which overall is a really good thing. I just kind of ran out of time. Life is one step forward, two steps back. But I am hoping to make up for this lost time, trying to get back to that one episode per week release schedule. That's the goal. So again, thank you for your support and your encouragement. Thanks for your patience. We're going to get back to normal, which hasn't been normal, but we'll make it normal, maybe, hopefully. Anyway, stay tuned for that. Next episode, we will follow Timur as he again turns his focus outwards, this time to the west, to the rich, fertile land of Khwarezm. Join me next time right here on the Timur Podcast.